Hi, this is Miss Saudi from Olympian High School. We're going to use the Traditions and Encounters textbook by Dr. Bentley to look at the last part of the reading under this heading, Conflicts with a Good Neighbor, together. So this is a section that's dealing with the U.S. policy changing towards Latin America. If you recall, the United States had first declared Latin America to be off limits for colonization using something called the Monroe Doctrine. Then they added to that, saying with the Roosevelt corollary, saying that the United States, and they did that in 1904, I believe, 1904, they basically said, not only should Europe stay out of Latin America, but we have the right to intervene in any states where U.S. business interests are threatened. That changes in the 1920s and 30s, largely because of two large historical developments that take place: the Great Depression, so the context of the Great Depression, and the context of the United States sensing that a Second World War is coming with the rise of the Nazis. So we want to make sure that our neighbor to the south of us, and all of Latin America, the neighbors to the south of us, have a more friendly relationship with us. We don't want to cultivate bad blood with a potential war coming. We want people to be on our side. And so we're going to see a change to something called dollar diplomacy. We see this during the presidency of William Howard Taft. He makes a speech where he talks about substituting dollars for bullets. And that basic idea is using the might of the United States economic power instead of intervening with the military. So instead of, for example, assassinating a president you don't like or landing U.S. troops on Latin American soil and countries, we were going to try to give them loans and use money to achieve our political ends, to use dollar diplomacy. Now, nowadays, historians tend to think of this word and this in this time like in a disparaging way. They refer to it as like an ineffective sort of policy, but it represents this desire to soften the relationship with Latin America. So you'll read about how they approve certain sweetheart deals and how they start to use the U.S. Marines to provide training for police forces in Latin American cultures to cultivate cordial, positive relations with the United States. When we get into the good neighbor policy, it's first really used with the presidency of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it lasts up until the coming of the Cold War. Why? Because we are not really trying to intervene as much. There's still some interventions, which we'll talk about, but we're trying to intervene militarily less until the Cold War. And then the Cold War, the U.S. is very much wanting to stop communism, to contain communism. And so we see the U.S. intervening in places where communism is rising. But up until the Cold War, you can think of the U.S. policy towards Latin America as being one wanting to be a good neighbor. Okay, so there are limitations to this good neighbor policy. One example is in Nicaragua. I'll show you where Nicaragua is on the map. So most of us here in San Diego know that Mexico is just to the south of the United States, but then sometimes for students, they get a little lost. So it's going to go Guatemala, Belize, think go big, and then El Salvador, Honduras, you can think eat honey, and then you've got Nicaragua. Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. Come up with your own little mnemonic to remember that. So here's where we're looking at that state. So in Nicaragua, it's a little bit complicated. There was a lot of American investment in certain industries, in the banana industry, you could say, the transportation industry. There were all kinds of investments. Eventually, there's going to be the civil war in Nicaragua. And you have in basically a restoration of order with the help of the U.S. Marines. There were some Nicaraguans that were very much against the occupation of Nicaragua, the stationing of troops, American troops, like U.S. Marines on Nicaraguan soil. And one of those people was a nationalist, someone who wanted, full sovereignty over the country by Nicaraguans. And that was by Augusto Cesar Sandino. You're going to need to remember his name because eventually he gets killed. And then his memory or his legacy of standing up to the big, powerful United States is going to be remembered by later groups who are going to call themselves the Sandinistas, this communist group later, when we talk about later in time, is going to take the name of Sandino as a way to rise up against the man. So as I told you, some people wanted to remove the U.S. presence, occupation from Nicaragua. So instead, the U.S. trained this National Guard to be stationed in Nicaragua. And then the U.S. helped back in elections that brought a man named Sacasa into power as president. And Sacasa put another man named Somoza in charge of the National Guard that had been trained by the American National Guard. And then this National Guard, Somoza's Guard, kept fighting with rebels that were, on the side of Sandino. Eventually, the Nicaraguan National Guard murders Sandino in 1934, and then Somoza goes on to become president, and he kisses up to the United States by renaming the main street in Nicaragua after FDR, and then he builds this large legacy. And basically, this is going to infuriate people who really resent the neocolonial power of the United States. Now, one thing you need to know is that you can think of the good neighbor policy as cultivating more conciliatory approach toward Latin American relations. So conciliatory is to create more a peaceful relationship, to rebuild trust. We see that when we see Cordell Hull, which is the Secretary of State in 1933, attend a conference where he basically says that the Roosevelt Corollary is no longer under effect. So you can read about this in your book. Then this is going to be tested in a big way when a man that was the president of Mexico challenges this non-interventionist policy by nationalizing oil. The word nationalize is different from the word nationalism. When we think of nationalism, we think of people having pride in their group, in their nation, in their community, whether that's for language, culture, history. They have a certain belief that they're a community and nation. That's nationalism, wanting your own country, wanting it to be a sovereign state. Nationalize is different. It's an economic word, and it basically means when the country takes over an industry, when the state takes over an industry that used to be a private industry. So for example, when Mexico nationalizes oil, they take over all of these companies that used to be controlled by US companies. So they're like, no, now the government owns it. Well, as you can imagine, American businessmen were furious. They really pressured and lobbied for the United States to go to war with Mexico. But because of the historical context and the fear of a potentially coming, a Second World War, the U.S. is not going to go to war, even with this provocative move. So the U.S. and British oil companies that had their land taken had to eventually agree to take less in compensation for the land that was taken from them. Cardenas was pretty smart. He based the compensation that he gave to these companies on the amount of tax value that they had claimed. And of course, they had claimed less because they didn't want to pay a lot of taxes. This ends up being a really important move with the Mexican people. It makes Cardenas more popular in his country. So we see sometimes when the good neighbor policy, works, and we also saw the limitations of the good neighbor policy with the deterioration of the international relations in the 1930s. So basically with the coming of World War II, with everyone seeing the growth of the Nazis and the rise of the Nazis, we're going to see a continued desire for the United States to cultivate a positive relationship with Latin America, to try to open Latin American markets to its exports, and to separate itself or distinguish itself from the militarist behavior of some European and Asian imperial powers. So again, we want to make sure that if there's another war, that our neighbors like us. There were also a lot of Mexican migrants coming to the United States. At the time, many Americans had this negative view of migrants as being cheap Mexican labor, and you can read about that in your book. So there's this agricultural business industry that wants these migrants to come, and then you have other groups that don't want the migrants to come. This is something that's interesting if you're of Mexican heritage or you're interested in Latin American history. You might want to look into these migrations. But what the United States does is they start to promote a more positive image of Latin Americans to improve the relationship between Latin American countries and the United States. One way they do that is by they created an entire department, by the way. I forget the exact name of it, but it made movies and songs and things that would soften the representation of Latin Americans to Americans and make a more positive relationship. There was this famous dancer, singer named Carmen Miranda. She's actually born in Portugal, but lived in Brazil when she was basically encouraged to come to the United States and become this Hollywood icon that represented Latin America. And she was this, sexy Latin American woman and beautiful. And she would wear these exotic, quote unquote, exotic foods on her head, these headdresses made of things like bananas, which many Americans had never seen. And so this is part of the intentional desire to create a more positive image of Latin Americans and soften the relationship with the United States. So this is part of the good neighbor policy. We also see this when the United Fruit Company, which was a company that had basically a monopoly on bananas in many Latin American countries, is going to appropriate or take the image of Carmen Miranda and turn her into a singing and dancing banana to try to sell more bananas. This is how you get the Chiquita banana. So really, really interesting. And this represents a different image of Latin Americans than the ones represented in other ways. For example, Diego Rivera's imperialism, which challenges all kind. Well, we'll not get into that, because you guys will have to look at these. But anyway, let me show you two things that I think will be interesting to you. First thing we're going to see is Carmen Miranda and her beautiful singing and dancing, and this desire to cultivate a positive relationship. We'll just watch 30 seconds so you can see who she is.
Meu ganza faz tica-tica-bum-tic. Vai eu cantar o tica-tica-bum-tic. Uma canção do tica-tica-bum-tic. Meu coração faz tica-tica-bum-tic.
Okay. So images like this, and then lastly, we're going to look at the appropriation of Carmen Miranda and Chiquita banana. Remember, Americans at this time had no idea how to use bananas. For us, they're so commonplace now, but you can imagine when they were like a cool, new, exotic fruit. Yeah? Okay, and this is by the United Fruit Company. So let's play.
I'm Chiquita Banana, and I've come to say bananas have to ripen in a certain way. And when they're flecked with brown and have a golden hue, bananas taste the best and are the best for you. You can put them in a salad. Green? No, not yet, my dear. That greenish way you're looking means that you are ripe for cooking. How about me? No. When you are fully ripe, my dear, those little flecks of brown appear. Hey. You're most digestible, my friend. Delicious, too, from end to end. You can put them in a pie, any way you want to eat them. It's impossible to beat them. But bananas like the climate of the very, very tropical equator. So you should never put bananas in the refrigerator. Bananas are a solid food that doctors now include in baby's diet. And since they are so good for baby, I think we all should try it. Oh! See?